Hey, what's up everyone? How's it going? This is Watch, and in this video I'll be doing a direct head-to-head camera comparison between two of the best crop sensor DSLR cameras they can get, both from Nikon and Canon. I'm talking about the D7200 versus the 7D Mark II. So if you're interested in getting the ultimate crop sensor DSLR cameras, this is a perfect comparison for you. So without any further ado, let's get right into this. Now, coming from a physical and design standpoint, both these two cameras are fairly similar. They're both made out of magnesium alloy in terms of build materials, and they're both weather sealed to some extent. The only thing is, in terms of fit and finish and durability, it looks like Canon has really put a lot of effort in making the 7D Mark II a camera that is virtually indestructible. It's very durable, very well made, and extremely rugged for any condition that you can throw it at. In terms of the life expectancy, the Mark II is rated for over 200,000 shutter actuations versus the D7200 is rated for about 150,000 shutter actuations. Now, interestingly, even though these two are categorized as crop sensor APS-C format DSLRs, the sensor size themselves is a little bit different. Generally speaking, Nikon uses a slightly larger APS-C size format compared to the Canon, but it also has a larger megapixel count of 24.2 megapixels versus 20.2 megapixels on the Canon. Now, at a closer glance, you'll see that the Canon actually has a larger overall pixels on the sensor than the D7200, which may translate to better low light performance, but we're going to have to find out whether that's true or not in our actual image comparison later on. Now, in terms of the image processing units, Canon is using the new Digic 6 processor versus Nikon's using their latest X-Speed 4 processor, which is 30% faster than the previous generation X-Speed 3 processor. Now, in terms of the ISO capabilities, the D7200 has a range of about 100 to 25,600 in its normal range, and it has an extended mode of 50 to 100,000 ISO. The 7D Mark II, on the other hand, has a range of about 100 to 16,000 ISO in its normal range, and the extended range goes up to 51,200 ISO. Now, looking at the viewfinder on both these two cameras, they're very similar. They're going to obviously use the pentaprism system because they are DSLRs, and they both offer 100% coverage, excellent for professionals. Furthermore, in terms of the rear displays, you're looking at a little bit different size and resolution, basically a little larger size on the D7200 of 3.2 inches versus about 3-inch display on the Canon, and in terms of resolution, it's a little bit higher on the D7200 as well. Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. In terms of the autofocusing system, we're looking at 51 points on the D7200, which is definitely quite a bit, but only 15 of those points are cross-type, versus the 7D Mark II has a very impressive 65 autofocusing points, and all those points are cross-type. And keep in mind that it's using the hybrid AF system, so you have access to all those points in live view and video mode. So it's very fast in terms of autofocusing. It's probably one of the best DSLR cameras for sports photography, and it's very accurate as well. Now, moving on, taking a look at the shutter capabilities on these two cameras, the D7200 hasn't really done much from the previous generation. You're looking at 6 frames per second, and if you shoot in 1.3 crop mode, you can get up to 7 frames per second on the D7200, versus the Canon completely wipes the floor at 10 frames per second. Very, very impressive. It's one of the fastest continuing shooting cameras that you can get in the market, up there with some of the highest cameras you can get from Nikon and Canon. Very impressive there. And the buffer is also larger on the Canon. You can shoot up to 31 stills in RAW mode and about 1,090 in JPEG, versus the D7200 could shoot about 18 RAW images in continuous burst mode. And if you shoot in JPEG, you can get up to 100 shots in the continuous burst mode. But there is absolutely no comparison between the two. The 7D completely destroys most cameras in its category when it comes to the burst mode capabilities, and the buffer is quite large as well. So if you're a nature or sports photographer, there is no competition here. Now, in terms of the media storage capabilities, the 7D Mark II has option for both an SD card and a compact flash card, versus the D7200 has dual SD card slots. On the other side, both cameras have a decent amount of connectivity options. Both have HDMI video output capabilities, as well as a microphone and headphone jack to basically monitor and use an external microphone if you want a better audio quality for your video. Additionally, you're going to have faster data transferring capabilities on the Canon because it's using USB Type 3 connectivity. Furthermore, in terms of the wireless capabilities, both cameras have Wi-Fi built into them, so you can connect your smartphone or tablet and shoot remotely, which is quite fantastic. The Canon actually has built-in GPS, but the D7200 actually has near-field communication, which makes connecting your smartphone or tablet a little bit easier if you have NFC enabled in those devices. Lastly, in terms of the battery performance, you'll be happy to note that the D7200 is actually very good in terms of battery performance. It's actually a 15% increase in battery life from the previous generation, getting over 1100 stills and over 80 minutes of video on a single charge. Now, the Canon 7D Mark II, one of the flaws of it is the battery performance. Unfortunately, unlike the previous generation camera, you're only going to get about 670 shots on average, and in terms of shooting video, you're only going to get about an hour or so on each battery. So the Nikon is better in terms of the battery performance at this stage of the game. Now, finally, with all that technical stuff out of the way, let's take a look at the actual stills capabilities of these two cameras. We're going to be shooting them in identical scenarios with the exact same lighting and scene. In terms of lenses, I have the Canon and Nikon version of the 18 to 35 f1.8 lens from Sigma, so we have a very similar lens on both cameras, and the only real difference should be the sensors inside. So without any further ado, let's get right into this and see which one comes out on top. Now, one thing that's kind of slightly apparent when you're looking at fine details on the Nikon is that it's slightly sharper than the Canon. Because it doesn't have an optical low pass filter, you are going to get those kind of qualities. So in terms of fine detail, you find just a hint more sharpness on the Nikon versus the Canon. The Canon, you can post sharpen and get very similar results, but thankfully you don't have to go through that process on the Nikon. Furthermore, in terms of color rendition, because we're shooting RAW, there's not going to be much of a difference there. We're bypassing all the image quality differences. If you shoot JPEGs, generally speaking, the Canon is typically a little bit more warmer than the Nikon, which is pretty stereotypical of Canon cameras. Now, in terms of low light capabilities, both these two cameras are nowhere near the capabilities of what you'd find on a full frame camera, but they're still not bad. They're very similar to each other in many regards. Basically, at ISO 100 to about 6400, they're very identical in terms of their noise qualities. They render out noise in a different pattern, but the noise is just as apparent in both settings. Once you go to the higher end spectrum, it looks like the Canon does a little bit better job in terms of cleaning up anything over 8000 ISO to 12800 ISO, and when you go beyond that, it's kind of pointless anyways, especially if you want usable shots. So very similar overall ISO performance on both cameras. In my experience, you're not going to select one over the other in terms of low light performance. Now, in terms of the video capabilities on both these two cameras, they're very similar in terms of settings. Both can do 1080p at 60 frames per second, but the Nikon does have to crop down to 1.3 magnification to get the 60 frames per second. If you shoot in 24 or 30 frames per second, you can shoot using the full size of the sensor, versus the Canon can shoot up to 60 frames per second on the full size sensor without having to do any crop, which is fantastic. There is a pretty big difference in terms of bitrate though. We can shoot all intra-frame on the Canon, which is going to render out a sharper overall motion, and it's going to have a almost double the bitrate as what we've seen in the D7200. Now, lastly, I do have to mention that the one big flaw on the D7200 is the fact that you cannot control the aperture in live view or video mode. So you're going to have to get out of live view mode, change your aperture, get back into live view mode, and start recording your video. That's a huge hassle, something that should have been addressed that isn't at this point. Versus the Canon, you can shoot in full manual aperture mode and control every aspect of your camera while you're shooting. So that's fantastic to see. So if you're a serious video shooter, you definitely have to get through some hurdles on the Nikon versus the Canon. Gives you a lot more freedom and control. Now, that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the video quality differences between these two. Now, as you can see from the video quality differences between the two, the Canon in most cases looks better to my eye. Certainly because of its higher overall bitrate and its enhanced video capturing capabilities. It has a fantastic autofocusing mode that is probably one of the best autofocusing modes for video in a traditional DSLR. It's up there with what you would find with Sony and Panasonic mirrorless cameras, which is certainly high praise. They both have jello-vision and rolling shutter issues because they are using CMOS chips, so you're definitely going to find those problems when you pan too quickly on your tripod or when you're shooting fast motion objects. Now, in terms of the low light video capabilities, here's where we find a little bit of difference between the two. The Canon renders out a little bit better image quality details, especially at ISO 3200 and beyond. After about 12,800 ISO, it becomes kind of unusable, but definitely at that higher ISO acceptable limit, it definitely performs a little bit better than what we find on the D7200. So if you want to shoot some video in low light capabilities, looks like the 7D Mark II has a slight edge up compared to the Nikon. Now keep in mind that the D7200 is really rated for a prosumer market. So somebody who's an avid photographer and wants to kind of step up their game in terms of photography and video. But the Canon 7D Mark II is more kind of geared for professionals, especially for people that do a lot of sports photography, nature photography, people who really need accurate and fast autofocusing capabilities with a burst mode that can rival the best DSLRs in the market. So definitely make sure you're considering that, because the price difference between the two is quite substantial. You are paying quite a bit more for the 7D Mark II, and the D7200 is certainly more in lines with the prosumer market of DSLR cameras. So again, make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like this video and it helped you out in any way. Definitely check out our channel for more comparison and reviews for the latest generation cameras and other technology out there. Definitely check out the description if you want more information about the D7200 and the 7D Mark II. And if you go through any of our Amazon links, we get a little bit of kickback and it makes this video possible. So thanks again for watching. See you later. Take care.